I never thought I would be afraid of flying. Growing up, I watched movies where people soared through the skies, and I dreamed of traveling the world. But my fear took root during a flight back from a business trip a couple of years ago, and the memory still haunts me. It was a late-night flight, one of those red-eye specials from Los Angeles to New York. The kind of flight where most passengers are half asleep before they even take off. I had been working long hours, and all I wanted was to close my eyes and catch some sleep during the flight. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight attendants performed their safety demonstrations, and I settled into my seat, trying to relax. As we ascended, I could feel the familiar sensation of the plane lifting off the ground. I closed my eyes, hoping to drift off. I was just about to doze off when I felt a jolt. The plane shuddered violently, and the seatbelt sign flicked on. The captain's voice came through the intercom, assuring us that it was just a bit of turbulence and that we'd be through it in no time. But the turbulence didn't stop. It grew worse. The plane pitched and rolled, and the overhead bins rattled as if they were about to burst open. I opened my eyes and glanced around. Most passengers were gripping their armrests, fear etched on their faces. Some were already clutching their loved ones, whispering prayers under their breath. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the back of the plane, making everyone jump. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging us into darkness. Gasps filled the cabin as panic spread like wildfire. I could hear the sound of people crying and praying, the tension so thick you could almost cut it with a knife. Then, just as quickly as it had gone dark, the emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow throughout the cabin. The captain's voice came back on, but this time he sounded more frantic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm and stay in your seats." I could feel my heart racing. This wasn't just turbulence, something was seriously wrong. The plane continued to shake, and the loud noises from the back grew louder. I turned to the woman sitting next to me, a young mother holding her child tightly. Her eyes were wide with fear, and I felt a surge of panic rise within me. The plane dropped suddenly, and screams erupted. The mother clutched her child even tighter, and I gripped my armrest so hard my knuckles turned white. At that moment, all the excitement I had once felt about traveling was replaced by a crushing sense of dread. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself, though my voice trembled. I tried to focus on my breathing, counting in and out as I remembered the breathing techniques I'd learned during yoga classes. But then another loud bang echoed, followed by an unnatural grinding noise that rattled the entire cabin. The lights flickered again, and I saw shadows moving in the aisle. Panic coursed through me as I strained to see what was happening. The shadows coalesced into figures, two men in dark clothing, their faces obscured by the dim emergency lights. They were making their way toward the front of the plane, and fear washed over me as I realized they didn't look like flight attendants. They moved with a purpose that sent shivers down my spine. I leaned over to the woman next to me. "What is happening?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," she replied, her voice shaky. "Maybe they're here to help." But deep down I felt that wasn't the case. The two men stopped a few rows ahead of us, and it looked like they were arguing with the flight attendants. The sound of raised voices mingled with the chaos of the cabin. Then one of the men suddenly pulled something from his coat, a gun. Panic surged through the cabin like a tidal wave. I could hear people screaming, and the mother next to me began to cry. Oh God," she repeated, shaking her head in disbelief. I wanted to move, to get up and run, but I was frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again, sounding more frantic than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a crisis. Please remain in your seats and stay calm." But how could anyone stay calm in the face of such terror? I could see the flight attendants trying to calm passengers down, but the chaos was too great. The man with the gun yelled something, and suddenly the other man lunged at him. A struggle broke out, and the gun went off. The deafening sound echoed through the cabin, and chaos erupted. People were screaming, some were crying, and others were trying to hide under their seats. I ducked down, instinctively covering my head with my arms, praying that I wouldn't be caught in the crossfire. Amid the chaos, I heard a loud crash from the cockpit. My heart raced as I realized that whatever was happening was escalating, and there was no escape. The plane continued to shake violently, and the lights flickered again. The next thing I knew, the plane began to dive. My stomach lurched as we plummeted through the air. I gripped the seat tightly, tears streaming down my face. This can't be happening, I thought. This isn't how it ends. As we descended, the plane started to level out, but the chaos was far from over. The two men were still fighting, and I could hear the sound of the captain's voice, desperate but barely audible. "Brace for impact." At that moment, everything seemed to slow down. I glanced around, seeing the faces of fellow passengers filled with terror. I thought of my family, my friends, and all the moments I'd take for granted. I didn't want to die in this tin can in the sky. The plane jerked again, and I closed my eyes, bracing for the worst. But just as I thought we were going to crash, the turbulence lessened and the plane stabilized. The noise around me faded, and for a moment, I thought we might be okay. Then I heard a series of loud thuds coming from the back of the plane. My eyes snapped open, and I turned just in time to see the two men being tackled to the ground by several passengers. They fought back, but it was too late. The passengers had taken control, and the men were subdued. The cabin erupted into cheers and applause, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The plane had survived, but what had just happened? As the adrenaline began to fade, reality hit hard. We were still in the air, and I was still terrified. The captain came over to the intercom again. "We have regained control of the situation. Please remain seated while we assess the situation." His voice was shaky, but there was a sense of relief mixed in. As we flew on in silence, the reality of what we had just experienced set in. I looked around at the faces of the other passengers. Some were still crying, some were in shock, and others were holding their loved ones close. After what felt like an eternity, we landed safely. As the plane touched down, a wave of relief washed over me, but it was mixed with the understanding of how close we had come to disaster. As the cabin doors opened and we were escorted off the plane by authorities, I took one last look back. I knew I'd never forget that night, the terror and chaos, the fear that gripped me as we fought for our lives in the sky. From that day on, I couldn't look at an airplane without feeling a pang of anxiety. I was a changed person, and every time I heard a plane fly overhead, I remembered that night, forever etched in my memory as a nightmare came to life. I was 24 when I agreed to house sit for a friend of a friend. I wasn't exactly strapped for cash, but the offer was too good to pass up. $500 for 4 days in a huge modern house, while the owner, a woman named Sarah, went on vacation. All I had to do was make sure the plants were watered, the mail was brought in, and the place didn't burn down. Seemed easy enough. The house was in a rural part of upstate New York, surrounded by woods on 3 sides. It had that sleek, modern design with big windows and a lot of open space. Honestly, it was the kind of place that seemed a little out of my league, but I figured it would be like a mini vacation for me too. Sarah left me a list of things to take care of. Water the plants on the porch, bring in the mail, and make sure the lights are off at night. Nothing too difficult. The first day was completely normal. I spent most of my time lounging on the massive couch in the living room, watching TV and enjoying the solitude. The view of the forest from the floor-to-ceiling windows was pretty peaceful. But that night, things started to get strange. Around 2 a.m., I was in the middle of a light sleep when I heard something that jolted me awake. It was a tapping sound, faint but consistent. At first, I thought it was just a branch brushing against the house, but when I got up to check, there was nothing outside. The wind wasn't even blowing. I told myself it was just the house settling or some normal noise that comes with being in an unfamiliar place, and I went back to bed. The next morning, I found the front door wide open. I know for a fact that I locked it before I went to bed. I'm always paranoid about locking doors, especially when I'm in someone else's home. I immediately checked the whole house, but nothing seemed out of place. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, nothing. I closed the door, locked it again, and went about my day, but the thought of that door being open gnawed at me. By the time the second night rolled around, I was feeling uneasy. I double-checked all the locks before heading to bed, and even placed a chair against the front door, hoping it would give me some peace of mind. That night, the tapping came again, only louder this time. It wasn't coming from a window, though. It was coming from the back door, the one that led to the deck overlooking the woods. I tried to ignore it, but it was relentless. I finally grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs to check it out. When I reached the door, I froze. There was a figure standing just outside, on the other side of the glass. It wasn't moving, just standing there, perfectly still, staring at me. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was tall, and its outline was wrong, like its arms were too long, or its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. My stomach dropped and I stepped back, heart pounding. Then it disappeared. I mean, it didn't run away or step into the shadows. It just wasn't there anymore. 1 second it was standing right in front of me, and the next, the deck was empty. I couldn't bring myself to open the door or even go outside to check. I locked every door and window in the house and sat on the couch with every light on until morning. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I seriously considered leaving, but I didn't want to freak Sarah out, and I still had 2 days left. Besides, I wasn't even sure what I saw. I could have been half asleep or just paranoid from being in an unfamiliar place. I convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination. The third night, though, something happened that I can't explain away. I was lying in bed again, wide awake, too afraid to fall asleep after what had happened the night before. The house was quiet, and I could hear every creak and groan the building made. Around midnight, I heard the tapping again. It started faint like the night before, but quickly became louder, more frantic. It wasn't just one spot anymore. The tapping was coming from every window, every door, all around the house. It was like someone, or something, was circling the building, banging on every surface it could find. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the police, but there was no service. I hadn't even noticed the lack of signal until that moment. My phone was completely useless. The tapping continued, more intense, more deliberate. I could hear it now, clear as day. Something was outside, trying to get in. Suddenly the power went out. Every light in the house went dark at once, and I was left standing in pitch black silence. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could feel a cold sweat running down my back. I didn't dare move. Then came the footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps coming from upstairs. I was downstairs in the living room, but I could hear them moving from room to room, deliberate and methodical, like someone, or something, was searching the house. It didn't make sense. No one else was supposed to be here. I hadn't heard anyone break in, and all the doors and windows were locked, but the footsteps were real. I stood frozen in place, listening as they grew louder and closer. They reached the top of the stairs and began descending, one step at a time. The floorboards groaned with each step. I held my breath, too terrified to move, praying that whatever it was would go away. But it didn't. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. I could feel something watching me, even though I couldn't see it. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to move. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps retreated. I listened as they moved back up the stairs, slower this time, almost as if whatever was there was giving up. The tapping on the windows faded too, until all I could hear was the wind in the trees. The power flickered back on. I didn't wait for the morning. I grabbed my things, threw them into my bag, and left. I didn't lock the door behind me. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of that house. Sarah never mentioned anything strange when she returned, and I never told her what happened. But I've never been able to shake the feeling that whatever was in that house wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Something was there, watching, waiting for something. I just don't know what, and I don't think I ever want to. A few years ago, I had an experience that changed me in a way I still don't fully understand. I never considered myself the paranoid type. I wasn't into horror stories or ghost hunting or anything that had to do with the supernatural. But what happened to me is something I can't shake. And no matter how hard I try to explain it, it just doesn't fit into anything rational. I haven't talked about it much because it sounds unbelievable, but it still haunts me every time I close my eyes. I was living in a small town in northern Minnesota. My job at the time was working in real estate, helping maintain vacation homes that were scattered around the forested areas near the lakes. The winter season was always the slowest. Most of the houses were empty, shut down for the cold months, so my job was mostly just checking on them, making sure the pipes hadn't burst or that no one had broken in. One of these houses was far more remote than the others. It sat at the end of a long, winding dirt road that twisted through dense woods. It was at least a 30-minute drive from the nearest small town, and even then, the place felt isolated. The owners hadn't used it in over a year, and as far as I knew, it hadn't been touched in months. The perfect spot for someone who wanted to completely disappear from society for a while. It was late December, and a particularly bad snowstorm had rolled through the area the night before I was scheduled to check on the house. The temperature had dropped to near record lows, and everything was covered in a thick layer of ice and snow. I was dreading the drive, but it was part of my job. The road leading to the house hadn't been plowed, and I had to park a mile out and walk the rest of the way. The snow was up to my knees and the woods were silent except for the sound of my boots crunching through the snow. The further I walked, the more isolated I felt. It wasn't long before the house came into view. The place was large, a 2-story log cabin with a wraparound porch, but something about it immediately felt off. It wasn't just that it was old or abandoned. There was an unnatural stillness that hung around the place, like the air was heavier and colder, despite the freezing temperature. I pushed the thought away and trudged through the snow to the front door. Unlocking the door, I stepped inside, immediately hit by the smell of stale air and dust. I'd been in the house before, but now it felt different, darker. The windows were iced over, making it hard for any light to get in, and the place was frigid. I could see my breath puffing in front of me as I moved from room to room. Everything seemed normal at first. Nothing was broken, no signs of entry. Just another cold, empty house. I made my way upstairs to check on the bedrooms when I noticed something strange. In the last bedroom on the left, there was a large wooden dresser pushed up against the far wall. That wasn't unusual, but as I scanned the room, I realized there was something behind it. The wallpaper in this particular room was faded and peeling, but behind the dresser, it looked completely untouched, almost brand new. I don't know why, but something about that detail made me uneasy. I approached the dresser and started to push it aside. It was heavier than I expected, and as I shoved it away from the wall, I noticed a crack running vertically up the wallpaper. I knelt and felt along the seam, my fingers tracing an outline. It wasn't just a crack in the wallpaper. There was a door hidden behind it. At this point, I probably should have stopped. I didn't have any business investigating further, but something compelled me to keep going. I pulled at the crack until the wallpaper peeled away, revealing an old wooden door. It didn't have a handle, just a simple latch that looked rusted from years of neglect. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. When I unlatched the door, it creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led downward. I hadn't seen any blueprints for the house that indicated a basement, so this was a surprise. The staircase was steep and completely dark. I shined my flashlight down, but couldn't see the bottom. I called out, but my voice echoed, hollow and empty. Against my better judgment, I started down the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, and the air grew colder the further I descended. It smelled damp, like mold and earth. I was about halfway down when I noticed the sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer, it was unmistakable. It was the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone, or something, was waiting at the bottom. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I was already too deep. I forced myself to keep moving, one step at a time until I reached the bottom. The beam of my flashlight danced across the room, a small, unfinished basement. It was damp, with stone walls and a dirt floor. There was nothing down there, no furniture, no signs that anyone had ever used the space. Except for one thing. In the center of the room there was a hole. A perfectly round, deep hole was dug into the dirt. It was about 3 feet wide, and when I shined my light into it, I couldn't see the bottom. The breathing grew louder, coming from inside the hole, rhythmic and steady, as if something was down there, waiting for me to come closer. I don't know why I did it, but I leaned over the edge of the hole, trying to get a better look. As I peered into the darkness, my flashlight flickered, and in that split second before it went out completely, I saw something move. Something was down there watching me. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and bolted up the stairs as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't care what it was or why it was there. All I knew was that I needed to get out of that house. When I reached the top of the stairs, I slammed the door shut and shoved the dresser back into place. My hands were shaking, and I was covered in cold sweat, despite the freezing air. I grabbed my bag and ran out of the house, not stopping until I reached my car. The entire drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that whatever I'd seen down there wasn't content to stay in that hole. I quit my job a week later. I told my boss that the long drives and isolation weren't for me, but the truth was, I couldn't bring myself to go near that house again. I haven't been back since, and sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear that slow, deliberate breathing coming from the darkness just outside my bedroom door. About 5 years ago, I took a job working as a park ranger at a state park in Colorado. The area was known for its picturesque hiking trails, tall pine trees, and mountain streams. I was in my mid-20s, eager to escape city life and spend my days outdoors. The job was fairly simple: monitor the trails, ensure no one was damaging the park, and respond to any emergencies that might come up. The park itself was huge, with miles of trails and campsites scattered throughout. Most of the time, it was pretty peaceful. A few hikers would come through during the day, but by evening, the park was usually empty, save for a couple of campers. I worked the night shift for the first few months, which meant patrolling the trails after dark. This wasn't something I had a problem with at first. I'd grown up camping and hiking, so I was comfortable being out in the woods at night. But there was one section of the park that always gave me the creeps, a deep valley called Blackwater Gorge. It was off the beaten path, far from the popular trails, and I'd only ever been there once during my initial training. The place was dense with trees, the air always seemed colder there, and even during the day it felt unnervingly quiet. The story went that a small village had once existed there in the early 1900s, but after a series of strange disappearances, the people abandoned it, leaving only a few scattered ruins deep in the forest. The park staff didn't talk about it much, and the area wasn't marked on the official maps. One night, in late September, I was on patrol. It had been a quiet shift so far. No campers or hikers had reported anything out of the ordinary. Around midnight, I got a call on my radio from one of the rangers in the northern part of the park. He sounded tense and asked if I could check out Blackwater Gorge. Some hikers had reported strange noises coming from that direction earlier in the evening, but they hadn't been able to investigate. I felt a knot form in my stomach as soon as I heard the name. The gorge was the one place in the park I'd hoped to avoid, especially at night. But it was my job, and I couldn't ignore the report. So reluctantly, I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and a map and headed toward the gorge. The trail leading to Blackwater was barely maintained, overgrown with roots and thick underbrush. The trees hung overhead, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. I hiked for about 20 minutes before reaching the edge of the gorge. From where I stood, I could see the land sloping down into a dense forest below. The air was still, and all I could hear was the rustle of leaves in the wind. But there was something else, something faint, like a low humming or buzzing sound, barely perceptible but there nonetheless. I turned on my flashlight and started down the narrow path that led into the gorge. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. It was as if the woods themselves were pressing in around me. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the humming sound grew louder, like an insect buzzing right next to my ear. I paused, shining my light around, but there was nothing. Just the dark shapes of trees and the occasional flicker of a moth in the beam. I kept walking, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that the isolation and darkness were just playing tricks on me. But the deeper I went into the gorge, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. That feeling you get when someone is watching you, it was overwhelming. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the bottom of the gorge. The trail opened up into a small clearing, surrounded by the remnants of the old village I'd heard about. Stone foundations, long overgrown with moss and vines, were all that remained of the buildings. In the center of the clearing stood an old well, the stones around it crumbling and worn. The humming sound was louder now, almost vibrating in my chest. I approached the well, shining my flashlight down into the darkness. The beam didn't reach the bottom. The buzzing seemed to be coming from inside the well, deep and persistent. I stared into the void, trying to figure out what could be causing the noise, when suddenly the flashlight flickered and went out. I stood there frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness was complete, suffocating. I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to turn back on, but it was no use. I could hear my breath, ragged and shallow, and then something else, footsteps. At first, they were faint, like someone walking on the other side of the clearing. Then they grew louder, moving toward me. My throat tightened, and I forced myself to speak. "Hello, is someone there?" No response. The footsteps stopped, just a few feet away from where I stood. I couldn't see a thing, but I knew something was there, standing right in front of me. My hand shook as I reached for my radio. I pressed the button to call for backup, but all I heard was static. That strange buzzing noise was now deafening, like it was coming from all around me. Then, without warning, a voice whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't be here." The sound of it made my blood run cold. It was a voice unlike anything I'd ever heard, low, guttural, inhuman. I stumbled backward, dropping the radio. My foot caught on something, and I fell to the ground, the buzzing filling my head, making it impossible to think. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep my balance. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran as fast as I could, crashing through the underbrush, tearing at the branches that clawed at my arms and legs. The buzzing sound followed me, growing fainter but never fully disappearing. It felt like the woods were alive, shifting and bending around me, trying to trap me inside. It took me almost an hour to find my way back to the main trail. By the time I reached the ranger station, my body was bruised and scraped, my clothes torn. My supervisor was waiting there, his face pale. "What happened to you?" he asked, but I couldn't explain it. I couldn't even speak. I quit the next day. Since then, I haven't gone back to the park and haven't stepped foot in the woods again. I still hear that buzzing sound sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet. And now and then, I catch myself thinking about Blackwater Gorge, wondering what was down in that well, wondering why I was told I shouldn't be there. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever I felt that night, whatever was down there in the darkness, it wasn't human. And I never want to find out what it was. Last summer, I took a job as a night security guard at a newly built warehouse on the outskirts of town. It wasn't exactly the most thrilling gig, but the pay was good and I could use the downtime to study for my classes. The place was massive, filled with crates of God knows what, and the company's strict policy was that nothing was to be opened or inspected by security. Just patrol, monitor the cameras, and report anything out of the ordinary. Easy, right? When I started, the warehouse was eerily quiet at night. My shift started at 10 p.m. and went until 6 a.m. Most nights, it was just me in that cavernous building, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant echoes of my footsteps to keep me company. The first few nights passed uneventfully. I'd make my rounds, check the cameras, and then sit in the small security office, reading or listening to music. It wasn't until about a week into the job that things started to feel off. It began subtly with small noises. I'd be sitting in the security office, and I'd hear what sounded like footsteps coming from one of the aisles of crates. But every time I'd check the cameras or go to investigate, nothing would be there. I figured it was the building settling, or maybe the wind pushing against the metal walls. I ignored it. I had to. The alternative was thinking someone was inside with me, which was a thought I didn't want to entertain. Then one night, about halfway through my shift, I was doing a routine patrol down one of the long aisles between the towering stacks of crates. The air felt heavier than usual, like the kind of pressure you get before a storm. As I reached the end of the aisle, I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck. It was so sudden that I jumped and spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. My heart was racing, but I tried to shake it off. The mind can play tricks on you when you're alone in a big space for too long. I finished my round and hurried back to the security office, locking the door behind me. As I sat down at the desk, I noticed something strange on the camera feeds. One of the cameras, positioned in the farthest corner of the warehouse, was glitching out. The image kept flickering, static lines running across the screen. I leaned closer, watching as the image cut in and out. For a split second, I saw something. A figure standing in the middle of the aisle. It was barely visible, just a shadow really, but I knew I saw it. My stomach dropped. I switched the camera feed, but when I went back, the figure was gone. I told myself the camera was faulty, that it was just a glitch, but my gut knew better. I wasn't alone in there. The next few nights things got worse. The noises became more frequent. Footsteps, faint whispers, and what sounded like crates shifting on their own. Every time I went to check, the warehouse was empty. Exactly as it should be. But the sense of being watched was overwhelming. It felt like eyes were on me, constantly, from the shadows between the crates. I started rushing through my patrols, spending as much time as possible locked in the security office. One night, around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the concrete floor. I froze my hand halfway to the door. The sound echoed through the warehouse, louder this time. It was coming from the far end, near the glitching camera. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and left the office, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder as I approached. My flashlight beam shook in my trembling hand. As I rounded the corner of one of the aisles, the beam caught something moving. A crate, one of the massive wooden ones, was shifting on its own, scraping across the floor. I stopped dead in my tracks, watching in disbelief. The crate moved again, as if something inside it was trying to get out. My mind raced. What the hell was in there? And then, just as quickly as it started, the crate stopped moving. The air was still heavy, suffocating. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the crate. When I was a safe distance away, I turned and ran back to the security office, slamming the door behind me. I didn't leave the office for the rest of the night. I couldn't. Whatever was in that crate, it wasn't natural. I kept my eyes glued to the camera feed, half expecting to see the figure again, but the warehouse remained still. No footsteps, no shifting crates, just silence. The next day, I told my supervisor about the noises and the crate. He laughed it off, said I was just imagining things, that I'd probably been up too late, and the quiet was getting to me. He checked the cameras from the night before, but of course, the footage was corrupted. That's when I started thinking about quitting. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. Whatever the reason, I went back the next night. It was quiet for the first few hours, with no footsteps and no glitches on the cameras. I started to think maybe I had imagined it all. And then just before 5 a.m., I heard a voice. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, coming from somewhere deep in the warehouse. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone, it wasn't right. It was pleading, desperate. It sounded human, but something about it sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and reluctantly stepped into the aisle. As I walked toward the sound, the voice grew louder, but still muffled, like it was coming from inside one of the crates. My hands were shaking as I approached the far end of the warehouse, where the dragging sound had come from the night before. The voice stopped. I stood there in the darkness, surrounded by towering crates, my flashlight flickering in the stale air. For a long moment, everything was still. And then, from behind one of the crates, I heard breathing, heavy, raspy breathing, like something struggling to take in air. My heart raced, my palms slick with sweat. I shined the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there. Just a space. The breathing grew louder and closer until it was right next to me. And then, as if something invisible had passed over me, the temperature dropped. My breath came out in a cold, foggy cloud. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the warehouse as I sprinted back to the security office. I locked myself inside and didn't leave until morning. I quit the next day. I didn't give a reason. I didn't need to. Whatever was in that warehouse, it wasn't something I was willing to confront again. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I left something behind in that building. Or maybe it followed me. It was late, around 2 in the morning, when I found myself on a desolate stretch of highway, driving back home after a long shift at work. The dark road seemed to stretch endlessly before me, and the only sound was the hum of my old sedan's engine. I had just left a friend's house where we had a few drinks, and though I was careful, the fatigue was starting to set in. The quiet night was unnerving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I drove, I noticed that my gas gauge was dipping dangerously low. I glanced at the clock and realized I hadn't passed a single gas station for miles. Just as I began to worry about running out of fuel, I spotted a flickering neon sign in the distance. Gas and go, it read. The lights were dim, but it was the first sign of civilization I had seen in ages. Pulling into the gas station, I noticed the place looked run down. The parking lot was littered with debris, and the building itself was old, the paint peeling, and the windows dirty. It was a far cry from the modern gas stations I was used to, but beggars can't be choosers. I parked my car at the pump and stepped out, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I approached the pump, and as I began filling my tank, I glanced around. There was an old diner attached to the gas station, its neon sign flickering erratically. It was a haunting sight, and I could see the silhouettes of a few figures inside, but they didn't seem to be moving. I shrugged it off and continued to pump gas. Just then, the door of the diner creaked open, and a figure stepped out. He was an older man, wearing a worn baseball cap and a faded plaid shirt. He walked toward me, a slight limp in his step, and I immediately felt a sense of unease wash over me. "Evening," he said, his voice gravelly. "Hey there," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "Got a full tank?" he asked, glancing at the pump. "Just about," I said, trying to ignore the growing discomfort in my stomach. He chuckled, but it felt off, almost like he was mocking me. "Better fill up while you can. Out here, you never know when you'll see another station." I nodded, trying to brush off his odd demeanor. I finished pumping gas, and as I stepped back to put the nozzle away, I noticed the man was still watching me. A grin plastered across his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Everything all right?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Just fine," he said, but there was a hint of something in his voice, something that made me uncomfortable. "You look like you could use a cup of coffee. We've got some fresh brew inside." I hesitated. It was tempting, especially since I was tired, but something about the way he was looking at me made my skin crawl. No thanks, I really should be getting home. Suit yourself, he replied, the grin still plastered on his face. He turned to walk back toward the diner, and I watched him go, my instincts screaming that I needed to leave. I quickly paid for the gas, climbed into my car, and locked the doors. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the diner one last time. The old man was now standing at the window, watching me intently, the same eerie grin on his face. I shuddered and pulled out of the gas station, not daring to look back. The road stretched ahead of me, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I drove away from that creepy gas station. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. But the farther I drove, the more I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in my gut. About 10 minutes down the road, I noticed my headlights illuminating something on the side of the highway. It was a figure waving for help. I slowed down, rolling my window down just a crack. "Everything all right?" I called out, squinting into the darkness. The figure stepped closer to the car, and my heart sank. It was a young woman, disheveled and dirty, her clothes torn and stained. "Please, I need help," she cried, her voice shaking. "My car broke down a little ways back, and I've been stranded. Can you give me a ride?" I hesitated. It was late, and I had heard enough horror stories about picking up hitchhikers. But there was something desperate in her eyes, a look of genuine fear. "Where's your car?" I asked cautiously. "Just down the road," she said, pointing in the direction I had just come from. "Please, I just want to get home." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and let her in. As she climbed into the passenger seat, I noticed her hands were trembling. "Thank you so much," she said, looking at me with wide eyes. "You have no idea how scary it is out here." "Yeah, I get that," I replied, trying to reassure her as I pulled back onto the highway. "I just came from that gas station back there. Felt weird. Tell me about it," she said, her voice low. "I was just trying to get some gas, and that old man kept staring at me. It gave me the creeps. I didn't want to stay there any longer than I had to." My heart sank as I realized we had both had unsettling experiences at that same gas station. "You were there too?" I asked, glancing at her. "Yeah," she nodded, looking out the window. "I thought I'd gotten away, but then my car died on me. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid I was going to be out there all night." We drove in silence for a few minutes, the tension thick in the air. I could feel my heart racing as I glanced at her. She seemed genuinely scared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As we approached the intersection where I had to turn off the highway, I saw headlights coming toward us from the opposite direction. But as they got closer, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The car was the same one I had seen parked at the gas station, a rusty old pickup truck. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I recognized the figure behind the wheel, the old man in the baseball cap. He slowed down as he passed us, and I caught a glimpse of his face. He was grinning that same unsettling grin, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. "Do you know that guy?" I asked the woman, my voice tight with fear. She shook her head, her eyes wide. "No, I've never seen him before." "Why?" "That's the guy who was staring at me at the gas station," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He gave me the creeps." Just then, the pickup truck suddenly made a U-turn and started to follow us. My heart raced as I pressed the accelerator, trying to put distance between us and that sinister figure. "What the hell?" I muttered. The woman turned to me, panic written all over her face. "Drive faster. We need to get away from him." I pushed down harder on the gas, the engine roaring, as I sped down the road. The pickup truck was gaining on us, its headlights illuminating the darkness. I could hear the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I glanced at the rearview mirror. The old man was right behind us, and the grin on his face sent chills down my spine. "Where should I go?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady as I swerved around a bend in the road. "Just keep going," she screamed, her voice filled with fear. "Don't stop." I tore down the highway, glancing at the speedometer as it climbed higher and higher. But the pickup truck was relentless, tailing us closely. Just when I thought I might lose him, he maneuvered to cut us off, swerving into our lane. I swerved to the side, narrowly avoiding a collision, and my heart dropped as I realized how close I was to crashing. "Go left," she shouted, and I turned the wheel sharply, veering onto a dirt road that branched off from the highway. The tires kicked up gravel and dirt as I accelerated, hoping to put some distance between us. But the old man followed without hesitation, his headlights blinding me in the rearview mirror. The dirt road twisted and turned, and I struggled to maintain control of the car as I barreled down it. I glanced at the woman beside me, her face pale with fear, and for a brief moment, I thought I might be able to escape. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of metal crunching against metal. The pickup truck had slammed into the back of my car, jolting us forward. "Hold on," I yelled, trying to regain control as I swerved wildly. "Get off this road," she screamed, her voice a mixture of panic and desperation. I spotted an opening to the side, a path that led into the woods. I swerved onto it, the trees closing in around us as I drove deeper into the darkness. The old man's truck followed, its engine roaring as it pushed forward. I could barely see where I was going, branches scratching at the sides of my car as I navigated the narrow path. I had no idea where I was heading, but I knew I had to get away from him. The woman clutched the door handle, her knuckles white. Just when I thought we might have a chance, the pickup truck came barreling through the trees, crashing into my side with a deafening thud. I felt the impact jolt my body, and the car spun out of control. My heart raced as I fought to regain control, but it was too late. We were careened into a ditch, the world spinning around us as everything went dark. When I finally came to, I was disoriented. The car was crumpled and tilted awkwardly. I blinked my eyes, trying to focus. The woman was beside me, unconscious but breathing. I unbuckled my seatbelt and tried to shake her awake. "Wake up! We need to get out of here!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. But just as I managed to rouse her, the sound of footsteps crunching on leaves reached my ears. I turned to see the old man standing outside the car, his figure illuminated by the faint light of the moon. He wore a twisted smile, and I could see the glint of something metallic in his hand. "Looks like you two are in a bit of trouble," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "But don't worry, I'm here to help." I felt a wave of fear wash over me as I realized that the nightmare was far from over. The darkness of the woods surrounded us, and at that moment, I understood just how deep I had stepped into a horror story that I might never escape. It was one of those long, endless nights on the road, the kind that stretches your patience and tests your resolve. The hum of the truck engine was a familiar comfort as I drove my rig down the desolate stretch of Highway 59. I had been on the road for almost 15 hours, delivering a load of fresh produce from the city to a small town in the Midwest. The night was eerily quiet, with only the sound of the tires rolling over the asphalt and the occasional crackle of static on the radio to keep me company. As the headlights of my truck illuminated the road ahead, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of light in the distance. I squinted and saw what appeared to be a small diner, its neon sign flickering erratically, casting an unsettling glow against the dark backdrop of the highway. I was starving, and the thought of a hot meal was tempting, so I decided to pull in. As I parked my rig, I took a moment to stretch my legs. The diner looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. The windows were grimy, and the sign that advertised open 24 hours looked as if it might fall apart at any moment. I stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming as I entered. The interior was dimly lit, with only a few scattered tables and booths. There was an odd smell that hung in the air, a mix of grease and something I couldn't quite place. A waitress in her 50s stood behind the counter, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked at me with weary eyes, and I could tell she had seen better days. "Sit anywhere you like," she said flatly, her voice lacking enthusiasm. I chose a booth near the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of the night outside. I glanced at the menu, but my hunger took over, and I decided to order whatever the special was, something that resembled a burger. As I waited, I noticed a few other patrons scattered throughout the diner. They seemed out of place, quiet men who hunched over their plates, speaking in hushed tones as if they were sharing secrets. After a few minutes, the waitress brought out my food. "Here you go, Han," she said, placing the plate in front of me. "Enjoy." The burger looked greasy, but appetizing enough. I took a bite, savoring the flavor as I leaned back in the booth. Just then, the door swung open, and a gust of cold wind swept through the diner. I looked up to see a tall man in a long coat walk in. He had wild hair, a scruffy beard, and an intense look in his eyes. He scanned the room, and when his gaze fell on me, I felt an uncomfortable shiver run down my spine. He walked over to my booth, the clatter of his boots on the linoleum floor echoing through the diner. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice gravelly. Sure," I replied, trying to hide my unease. "Long night?" he asked, settling in across from me. "Yeah, just finished a delivery. I'm a truck driver," I said, taking another bite of my burger. Driving at this hour can be dangerous, he said, leaning in closer. You never know what might be lurking out there. I shrugged it off, trying to play it cool. I've been doing this for years. I can handle it. He chuckled, but there was a strange edge to it. You think you're safe in here? This diner has its secrets, you know. I frowned, unsure how to respond. What do you mean? He leaned back, his eyes darting around the room before settling back on me. Let's just say this place isn't what it seems. People come in, and they don't always leave. The waitress returned with a cup of coffee, setting it in front of me with a knowing look. Everything okay over here? She asked, glancing between the two of us. Just having a conversation, I said, trying to keep my tone light. The man smirked. Sure, but be careful who you talk to. You never know who might be listening. My unease grew as I tried to change the subject. So what do you do? He leaned in closer, and his voice dropped to a whisper. Let's just say I've seen things you wouldn't believe. I started to feel trapped, the walls of the diner closing in on me. I should probably get going, I said, glancing at my watch. I still have a long drive ahead. Drive safe, he said, a sinister smile creeping across his face. You might want to check your tires before you hit the road. I felt a cold sweat forming on my brow as I got up to leave, hastily tossing a few bills on the table. As I walked to the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching me, his eyes boring into my back. I stepped outside, the chilly air hitting me like a wave. I glanced around the parking lot, my heart racing as I noticed a few other trucks parked nearby. Just as I reached my rig, I heard the door of the diner swing open behind me. I turned to see the man emerging, his face twisted into a grin. You be careful now, he called out, his voice echoing in the empty night. I wouldn't want anything to happen to you. I climbed into my truck, locked the doors, and took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. As I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back at the diner. The man stood at the door watching me leave, the same eerie grin plastered across his face. The road stretched out before me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. The headlights illuminated the dark stretch of highway, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. It felt as if the shadows were closing in around me, lurking just out of sight. As I drove, I couldn't help but replay the man's words in my mind. This diner has its secrets. I shook my head, trying to brush off the paranoia. It was just an unsettling encounter. I'd had plenty of those on the road. But something about the way he spoke sent chills down my spine. Hours passed as I continued down the highway, the darkness enveloping me like a thick blanket. I turned on the radio, hoping to distract myself from the unease creeping into my thoughts. The static crackled, and I fiddled with the knobs, trying to find a station that didn't sound like it was coming from the grave. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang, and my truck jolted to one side. My heart raced as I fought to regain control of the vehicle. What the hell? I muttered to myself, pulling over to the side of the road. I got out and immediately noticed it, a flat tire. Cursing under my breath, I crouched down to inspect the damage. As I did, I remembered the man's warning from earlier. You might want to check your tires. A wave of dread washed over me as I realized he had likely tampered with them. I grabbed my toolkit from the cab and began to change the tire, but my hands trembled as I worked. The shadows around me seemed to lengthen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just then, I heard a rustling in the nearby bushes. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest. Hello, I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response came, only the whisper of the wind through the trees. I finished changing the tire, my eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. As I climbed back into the truck, I felt a sudden chill. I started the engine, and the headlights illuminated the road ahead. That's when I saw it, a figure standing a few yards down the road, silhouetted against the darkness. I squinted, my breath catching in my throat. It was the man from the diner, standing there in the middle of the highway, a twisted smile on his face. He raised a hand and waved as if he were greeting an old friend. I slammed the truck into gear and took off, tires screeching against the asphalt. I didn't look back, I just wanted to put as much distance between us as possible. The road blurred beneath me as I sped away, my heart racing with each passing second. But as I drove, the sensation of being followed crept in again. The shadows felt alive, pressing in against my window. I couldn't shake the thought that he was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for his moment to strike. I drove for what felt like an eternity, the landscape slowly shifting from endless highway to rural backroads. The moon hung high in the sky, illuminating the way, but even the moonlight felt suffocating. Finally, I spotted the lights of a small town up ahead. Relief washed over me as I realized I was nearing safety. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, desperate to escape the paranoia that had gripped me. As I parked, I glanced around, searching for any signs of the man. The gas station was empty, but the attendant behind the counter looked at me with a concerned expression. "You all right, man?" he asked. "Yeah, just a long night," I replied, trying to shake off the lingering fear. "Better be careful out here," he said, his voice low. "Things can get weird on this stretch of road." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You've heard about that diner?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. The attendant nodded gravely. "Yeah, it's a notorious spot. Not many come out of there unscathed. Best to keep driving if you can." I glanced out the window, half expecting to see that familiar figure lurking in the shadows. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. As I filled up my tank, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I hurried back to the truck, my heart pounding. I wanted nothing more than to hit the road and put this nightmare behind me. But just as I climbed back in and locked the doors, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. It was him. The man from the diner stood just outside the gas station, staring directly at me with that twisted grin. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the keys, desperately trying to start the engine. The world around me felt like it was closing in, and all I could think about was getting away. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, tearing out of the gas station and onto the road. I didn't stop until I was far away from that place, the silhouette of the diner fading into the darkness behind me. But even as I drove, I knew the nightmare wasn't over. The man's face lingered in my mind, his haunting smile a reminder of the horrors that lurked on the road. I gripped the wheel tightly, vowing never to let my guard down again. The night was one of those quiet, eerie evenings that seemed to stretch forever. I had just moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, a place I thought would be perfect for me, a cozy little spot where I could focus on my writing. It was an old building with creaky floors and thin walls, but it was affordable and had a certain charm that drew me in. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I settled into my routine, typing away at my laptop, trying to immerse myself in the story I had been working on for weeks. The soft hum of the heater filled the silence, creating a sense of warmth despite the chill that settled outside. I glanced at the clock. It was nearing midnight, and I was still lost in my work. But then the power flickered, and the lights dimmed for a moment before coming back on. I frowned and looked out the window, but the street lights were still glowing brightly, casting shadows against the pavement. It was strange, but I shrugged it off, attributing it to the old wiring in the building. I returned to my story, the sound of my fingers tapping against the keyboard filling the room. A few minutes later, I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the window. I paused, glancing up from my laptop. The tapping continued, rhythmic and persistent. I stood up and walked over to the window, pulling back the curtains to peer outside. The street was deserted, save for a few leaves rustling in the wind. My heart raced as I scanned the darkness, trying to shake off the feeling of unease creeping in. It was probably just a branch hitting the glass, I told myself. I returned to my writing, but the tapping resumed, louder this time, almost insistent. With a sigh of annoyance, I made my way back to the window. I yanked open the curtain, prepared to yell at whatever was causing the disturbance. But when I looked outside again, I froze. There was a figure standing across the street, shrouded in shadow. I squinted, trying to make out the details. It was a woman, her long hair hanging loosely around her shoulders. She wore a white dress that glimmered in the faint light. But her face was obscured, hidden in the shadows. My heart began to race as the figure remained perfectly still, just watching me. "Hey!" I called out, my voice breaking the silence of the night. "What do you want?" But she didn't respond. Instead, she took a step closer, her movement almost gliding rather than walking. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for a moment, I considered closing the curtains and pretending I hadn't seen anything. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened the window slightly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" At that, she lifted her head slightly, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Her face was pale, almost sickly, and her eyes, those hollow, dark eyes, stared straight through me. I couldn't look away. It was as if she was pulling me into her darkness. Suddenly, she raised her hand, pointing directly at me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. Help you with what? I asked, confusion mingling with fear. Please, she said again, her voice more urgent. Help me. I'm lost. Before I could respond, the lights flickered again, this time going out completely. The world outside the window plunged into darkness, leaving only the faint glow of the streetlights to illuminate the scene. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The darkness in the room felt oppressive, and I fumbled to find my phone, the only source of light I had. As I turned on the flashlight, the beam illuminated the walls around me. I looked back out the window, but the woman was gone. Panic surged through me as I leaned closer, trying to see if she had moved away or if she was still hiding in the shadows. My breathing quickened, and I felt trapped in my apartment. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. It was just a prank, I told myself. Maybe some kids messing around. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something about her, something unsettling that made me uneasy. I decided to get some fresh air, hoping it would clear my mind. I grabbed my jacket and slipped on my shoes, then headed out of the apartment. The hallway was dimly lit, and the flickering lights only added to the eerie atmosphere. I moved cautiously, each step echoing through the empty corridor. When I reached the stairs, I hesitated. Should I go outside? I could just stay in my apartment and forget about the whole thing. But the urge to investigate overpowered my fear. I descended the stairs slowly, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. Once outside, the cold air hit me like a wave, but it was refreshing. I looked around, scanning the street for any sign of the woman. The street was empty. The only sound was the rustling of leaves. I walked further out, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, illuminating the ground in front of me. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling. Are you out here? No response. I continued walking, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the pavement. Just when I was about to turn back, I caught a glimpse of something at the far end of the street, a flicker of white in the darkness. My heart skipped a beat as I saw her again, standing at the edge of the sidewalk. I took a step forward. Are you okay? Please talk to me. But she just stood there, her head tilted slightly to the side as if observing me. The closer I got, the more I could see the details of her face. Her skin was almost translucent, and her eyes were wide, filled with a deep sadness that sent chills down my spine. Why are you doing this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Help me, she pleaded again, her voice a haunting echo. Please, I need help. Before I could respond, the streetlights flickered again, plunging the street into darkness. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me as I stood there, frozen. I raised my flashlight, but when the light flickered back on, she was gone. I spun around, my heart racing. Where did you go? I shouted, panic rising in my chest. What do you want from me? I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I turned on my heel, ready to run back to my apartment, but the darkness felt alive, almost suffocating. Just then, I heard a faint whisper behind me. Help me! I whipped around again, shining my flashlight into the void. Stop it! I yelled, anger mixing with fear. What do you want? But the only response was the soft rustle of leaves and the echo of my voice. I was alone. I turned back towards the apartment, sprinting up the steps and bursting through the door, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath. My heart felt like it was about to explode. The apartment felt safe, cocooned away from whatever was outside. I flipped the lock and collapsed onto the couch, my mind racing. What had I just experienced? Was it a figment of my imagination, or was there truly something sinister lurking outside? I picked up my phone, scrolling through social media as a distraction. But as I did, I heard it again, the soft tapping on the window. My stomach dropped. I looked up slowly, dread pooling in my gut. The tapping continued, each sound like a tiny hammer driving into my sanity. I had to look. I had to know. I stood up, my legs shaking as I approached the window. I took a deep breath, pulled back the curtain, and peered outside. The street was empty again, the only light coming from the distant street lamp. But then, in the shadows, I saw her once more. The woman stood at the edge of the street, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. I opened the window, my voice trembling. What do you want? Help me, she whispered, her voice softer this time, almost a sigh. Please. The desperation in her voice pierced through my fear, and for a moment, I hesitated. How? I asked, my heart racing. Follow me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it echoed in my mind. Before I could respond, she turned and began to walk away, gliding effortlessly down the street. Something deep within me screamed to run, to stay locked in my apartment, but an inexplicable force drew me to her. I climbed out of the window, my feet hitting the ground softly. I followed her, my heart pounding as I stepped onto the dark street. The moment I moved, she turned back to me, her hollow eyes filled with a mixture of longing and despair. "Come," she urged, and I felt an overwhelming pull to obey. I followed her into the night, the shadows enveloping me as I walked deeper into the darkness, unaware of the horrors that awaited me in the depths of the unknown. Each step felt like a descent into a waking nightmare, and as the distance between my apartment and me grew, I realized too late that there was no turning back. There's this abandoned hospital in my hometown that everyone talks about but nobody goes to. St. Mary's, it's called. It's been shut down for years, ever since the funding dried up. It just sits there, a massive crumbling building at the edge of town, half swallowed by the woods. Some people say it's haunted, others just say it's dangerous because of how unstable the place is. For me and my friends, it was something else entirely, a challenge. We'd heard stories growing up about strange sounds coming from inside the building, of lights flickering in the upper windows, despite there being no power for decades. There were rumors of people going inside and never coming out, but those were always written off as urban legends. It didn't stop the uneasy feeling that crept in when you stood too close, though. But that was the point, right? To prove we weren't scared, to do what no one else would. One night, a couple of weeks ago, my friend Jamie dared me to go in. It was one of those late-night, beer-fueled conversations that started as a joke, but escalated fast. Jamie, Tom, and I had been talking about St. Mary's as usual, when Jamie said, "Why don't you just go in? I bet you won't last 10 minutes. Tom laughed, chiming in, "Hell, I'll even throw in $50 if you do." It was stupid, but the thing is, I'd been wanting to see what was inside for a long time. I wasn't even sure why, but the place had always called to me. Maybe it was the sheer size of it, or how it seemed to loom over the town like a bad memory. Or maybe I just wanted to prove something, to myself, to my friends. So I said yes. We grabbed some flashlights and headed out. The drive to the hospital didn't take long. The closer we got, the more I started second-guessing myself. The hospital looked even more imposing at night, its tall, broken windows staring down at us like hollow eyes. The front gate was long gone, leaving only rusted chain-link remnants. We parked the car on the overgrown street, the silence outside pressing down on us. Tom turned off the engine and looked at me. "You sure you want to do this, man?" he asked, his voice unusually serious. Jamie didn't say anything, just handed me a flashlight with a nervous grin. I nodded, even though my gut was telling me to turn back. I wasn't about to back down now. The entrance to St. Mary's was a set of massive double doors, once white, but now peeling and rotten. One door hung off its hinge, the other had collapsed entirely. I stepped through the gap, and immediately, the air changed. It was thick, almost stifling, like walking into a room that hadn't been disturbed in years. The smell of mold and decay was overpowering. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the empty hallway. The place was a maze, hallways stretched out in every direction, and the darkness swallowed the weak beam of my flashlight faster than it should have. The walls were covered in graffiti, names, messages, symbols I didn't recognize. Some of it looked fresh, others had faded with time. I kept moving, feeling my way through the place, trying not to think about how far I was going. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, like something scraping against the floor. I froze, turning off my flashlight instinctively. For a few moments, I stood there in complete darkness, my ears straining to catch the sound again. Nothing, just the low hum of silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or something. The place was old and abandoned. It made sense, but then it came again, louder this time. A distinct, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. It was coming from deeper inside the building. My first thought was to run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn back and get out. But I didn't. Something made me move forward instead, slowly, carefully, following the sound. As I got closer, I noticed something else. The air was getting colder. Not just a little cold either, bone-chilling, the kind of cold that sinks into your skin, making your breath fog up in front of you. I found myself in what looked like an old operating room. The walls were lined with broken shelves and rusted equipment, and in the center was a large metal table. I shined my flashlight around, trying to make sense of the room, when the light hit something that made my blood freeze. There, standing in the corner, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow or a piece of equipment that I'd mistaken for a person. But as I stared, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was a man, or at least something shaped like one. He, or it, was completely still, standing in the far corner of the room facing me. His features were hard to make out in the dim light, but I could see enough to know that something was very, very wrong. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and his limbs were too long for his body. His head was tilted slightly to the side like he was watching me, but there were no eyes, just empty sockets where eyes should have been. Felt paralyzed. My legs wouldn't move, and my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. The figure just stood there, silent, motionless, watching. And then, without warning, it began to move. It didn't walk, it slid, its feet never lifting from the floor. The dragging sound returned, louder now, echoing through the empty room. It was coming toward me, slow and deliberate, and I knew at that moment that I had to get out. I turned and bolted down the hallway, not daring to look back. I could hear the sound behind me, that horrible dragging noise, growing faster, closer. I ran as fast as I could, crashing through doorways and hallways that all looked the same. My flashlight bounced wildly, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get out. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the faint outline of the entrance. I threw myself through the door and into the night air, slamming into the car. Jamie and Tom were waiting, their faces pale, eyes wide. "What happened?" Jamie shouted, grabbing my arm. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. All I could do was get in the car, my body shaking uncontrollably. We sped away from St. Mary's, the hospital disappearing into the darkness behind us. None of us said a word for the entire ride back. I never told Jamie or Tom what I saw in there. I didn't need to. Whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't something I could explain, even if I wanted to. I haven't gone back since. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I still hear that sound. The soft, rhythmic dragging, closer every time. The lake cabin was supposed to be a quiet weekend away. Just me and my girlfriend, Alyssa. We'd been dating for almost a year, and she thought it would be fun to rent a secluded cabin near a lake, far away from the noise and stress of the city. It sounded perfect. No neighbors, no distractions, just us and the peaceful woods. The cabin was about a 3-hour drive from where we lived, and by the time we arrived, the sun was starting to set. The place was exactly what I imagined. Small, rustic, with a porch that looked out over the lake. The water was so still, it looked like glass, reflecting the trees and the fading orange sky. It was beautiful, almost unreal. We unpacked quickly, eager to start our weekend. Inside, the cabin was cozy. It was a little dated, but that added to its charm. There was a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a couple of old armchairs. The bedroom was upstairs in the loft with a large window that overlooked the woods. It wasn't long before Alyssa made dinner, and I sat on the porch with a beer, enjoying the view. The silence was soothing. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. It felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. As the night fell, the woods around us grew darker, the trees fading into silhouettes against the starry sky. After dinner, we decided to take a walk by the lake, our flashlights cutting through the inky blackness. There was something serene about the isolation, but it also felt unsettling. It was quiet, too quiet. About halfway around the lake, Alyssa stopped. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I listened, but all I could hear was the sound of the wind in the trees. "No, what was it?" She shook her head, her eyes scanning the woods. "I don't know. It sounded like footsteps." Behind us, we stood there for a few moments, listening, but there was nothing. I laughed it off, trying to ease her nerves. It's probably just an animal. We're in the woods after all. She didn't seem convinced, but we continued walking. The path was narrow, lined with thick trees that cast long shadows across the ground. Now and then, I thought I heard something too. A faint crunch, like someone stepping on a twig. But whenever I turned around, there was no one there. We cut the walk short and headed back to the cabin. By the time we got inside, Alyssa was visibly shaken. I could tell the isolation was starting to get to her. To be honest, it was starting to get to me too. There was something about the darkness out there. The silence felt too heavy, like it was hiding something. We decided to call it a night. After brushing our teeth and getting into bed, Alyssa fell asleep almost immediately, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay there, staring out the window at the trees, my mind racing with thoughts of the footsteps we'd heard. Then at around 2 a.m. I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was faint, but it was there. like someone gently tapping their fingers against the glass. I turned my head slowly, trying not to wake Alyssa, and stared at the window. There was nothing there, just darkness. I told myself it was probably a branch, swaying in the wind and tapping against the glass. But then I remembered, the nearest tree was at least 10 feet from the cabin. The tapping continued, more insistent now, like whatever it was wanted me to know it was there. My stomach twisted in knots. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, careful not to make a sound, and crept toward the window. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the edge of the curtain, before pulling it back. Nothing, just the empty dark woods. I let out a shaky breath and dropped the curtain, feeling stupid for letting my imagination get the better of me. I climbed back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I didn't mention the tapping to Alyssa. I didn't want to freak her out, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. We spent the day hiking and exploring the area around the lake, trying to enjoy the peaceful setting, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. Now and then, I caught Alyssa glancing over her shoulder, as if she expected to see someone watching us. When we got back to the cabin that evening, we decided to light a fire in the fireplace and relax for the night. We roasted marshmallows, talked about how great it was to get away, and tried to push the weirdness of the previous night out of our minds. But then, just as we were about to head to bed, we heard it again. A soft, rhythmic tapping, this time coming from the front door. Alyssa's eyes went wide, and I could see the fear on her face. "What is that?" she whispered. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and motioned for her to stay put. "I don't know. Stay here. I'll check it out." I walked slowly to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping continued, steady and persistent. I took a deep breath and opened the door. No one was there. I shined the flashlight outside, sweeping it across the porch and the yard, but everything was still. The tapping had stopped. I stepped outside, half expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the silent woods and the dark lake beyond. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Alyssa was standing in the middle of the room, her arms wrapped around herself. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Nothing," I said. "There's no one out there." She didn't look convinced. "We should leave. Let's pack up and go. Right now." I wanted to tell her she was overreacting, but part of me agreed. Something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I could feel it. The sense of being watched, the tapping, the footsteps in the woods. It all added up to something I couldn't explain, but I knew it wasn't good. We quickly packed our bags and loaded them into the car. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the cabin, its dark windows staring back at me like hollow eyes. For a moment I thought I saw movement inside. A shadow shifts behind the curtains, but I didn't stick around to find out. As we drove away, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, as we had narrowly escaped something terrible. I didn't know what was out there in those woods, but I knew one thing for sure. I'd never go back, and whatever was out there, I hope I never see it again. It was supposed to be a classic road trip. Just my best friend Sarah and me, hitting the open road in her beat-up old sedan, bound for the coast. We had been planning this trip for months, dreaming of sandy beaches and long drives with the windows down. But as we rolled into the small town of Hollow Creek, it became clear that our adventure was about to take a dark turn. As we cruised down the main street, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The town was eerily quiet. No bustling shops or people were chatting on the sidewalks. Instead, the few locals we passed seemed to stare at us with a mixture of curiosity and something darker. A shiver ran down my spine as I caught a glimpse of an old gas station with a flickering neon sign that read, "Open." "Let's stop and fill up," Sarah suggested, oblivious to the unsettling atmosphere. I hesitated but didn't want to ruin her excitement, so I nodded. We pulled into the gas station, and as Sarah hopped out to pump gas, I remained in the car, fiddling with the radio. The gas station was run down, with cracked pavement and peeling paint. A lone attendant, an older man with wild gray hair and a scruffy beard, was leaning against the building, watching us intently. I could feel his eyes boring into me from the moment we parked. I turned the radio up, trying to drown out the awkwardness. After a few minutes, I noticed Sarah was taking longer than expected. I glanced out the window to see her chatting with the gas station attendant. They were both animated, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that washed over me. I could see his eyes darting toward me, and I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Finally, Sarah came back to the car with a smile plastered on her face. "He's super nice. Told me about a shortcut to the coast," Said it'll save us a few hours, she said as she slid into the driver's seat. I forced a smile, but my gut instinct screamed at me. A shortcut? Are you sure it's safe? She waved me off. Come on, it's just a small detour. What could go wrong? Reluctantly, I agreed. As we pulled out of the gas station, I stole a glance back at the attendant. He was watching us again, a grin spreading across his face that sent a chill down my spine. The sun was beginning to set as we drove deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around us. The road was narrow and winding, and soon we found ourselves surrounded by thick foliage. I tried to relax, telling myself it was just an adventure, but the ominous feeling lingered. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached a fork in the road. Which way did he say to go? I asked, feeling the weight of the darkness creeping in. Left, I think? Sarah replied, glancing at the hastily scribbled directions she had taken from the attendant. As we turned onto the smaller road, the atmosphere shifted. The trees seemed to loom closer, the shadows darker. I felt a sense of foreboding wash over me, and I could tell Sarah was starting to feel it too. Maybe we should turn back, I suggested hesitantly. Just a little further, she urged, her voice tinged with excitement. I want to see where this leads. We drove on, and soon the road began to decline into a valley. The air felt heavy, and the wind howled through the trees. The scenery shifted from dense woods to an open area with a view of a small lake reflecting the dimming sky. It was beautiful, but it did little to alleviate my unease. Suddenly our car sputtered, and the engine began to cough. What's happening? I exclaimed, panic rising in my chest. Just a little hiccup, Sarah said, trying to reassure me. It's probably just the gas. But as she pressed down on the accelerator, the car lurched and came to a stop. No, not now! She banged the steering wheel in frustration. I glanced around, searching for any signs of help. In the distance, I spotted a small cabin near the lake. There's a house over there. Maybe we can ask for help? Great idea, Sarah said, her voice wavering slightly. We both stepped out of the car, the chill of the evening air wrapping around us. As we walked toward the cabin, the atmosphere grew heavier, the woods seeming to close in around us. The cabin looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. I felt a shiver run down my spine as we approached. Do you think anyone's home? I asked, glancing back at the car. The road was empty, the silence surrounding us deafening. I don't know, but we can't just stand here, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the growing tension. As we reached the door, I hesitated. Maybe we should wait for someone to pass by, I suggested, but she knocked before I could voice my concerns. The sound echoed ominously in the stillness. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing an older woman with wild hair and piercing eyes. What do you want? She asked, her voice raspy. We were hoping you could help us, Sarah began. Our car broke down, and... Get inside, the woman interrupted, stepping back and motioning for us to enter. We exchanged a worried glance but followed her into the dimly lit cabin. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of musty wood and something else. Something rotten. The walls were adorned with strange symbols and photographs of what looked like bizarre rituals. My heart raced as I scanned the room, feeling the weight of dread settle over us. Sit, the woman ordered, gesturing toward a worn-out couch. We complied, our anxiety palpable. She moved to a corner of the room and grabbed a small, flickering lantern, casting eerie shadows against the walls. What brings you to these woods? She asked, her eyes narrowing. We were just trying to find a shortcut to the coast, Sarah explained, her voice shaky. But our car broke down. Shortcuts can be dangerous, the woman replied cryptically. People don't come back once they enter these woods. Wait, what do you mean? I asked, a chill running down my spine. She looked us over, her gaze penetrating. There are things in these woods that hunger for souls. Once you disturb them, there's no turning back. I felt a surge of panic as I exchanged worried glances with Sarah. We didn't mean to disturb anything. We just need help, I pleaded. The woman paused, her expression unreadable. The only help I can give you is a warning. Leave this place before nightfall, or you will regret it. My heart raced as fear gripped me. But we can't leave. Our car is... Do you want to die? She interrupted, her voice rising. Leave now, I felt a surge of adrenaline. Fine, we'll go, I shot back, standing up. But you're not helping us at all. The woman's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the door. We need to go. As we stepped outside, the sun had fully set, casting the world into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use its light, but there was no signal. The woods were silent, too silent, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We can't just wander around in the dark, Sarah whispered, panic creeping into her voice. We'll head back to the car. It's our only option, I said, trying to sound confident. We turned and started walking back through the trees, the darkness wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon the road where our car was parked. But as we approached, a sense of dread washed over me. The car was gone. "Where is it?" I gasped, my heart racing. "It was right here," Sarah exclaimed, her voice trembling. "What the hell happened?" "Maybe someone took it," I said, trying to suppress my rising panic. "We need to get back to that cabin. She might have seen something." "No," Sarah shouted, fear in her eyes. "We can't go back there. We need to find another way out of here." Just then we heard it, a rustling in the bushes nearby. My heart stopped as I turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a man, his clothes tattered and dirty, his eyes wide with terror. "Help me," he cried, stumbling toward us. "They're coming for me." "Who's coming?" I asked, my heart racing. "They know you're here. You have to run," he yelled, glancing behind him as if expecting something to leap from the darkness. "What do you mean?" I demanded, but he was already pushing past us, sprinting into the woods. "We can't just stand here," Sarah urged. "We have to follow him." We took off after the man, my heart pounding in my chest. We weaved through the trees, branches clawing at us as we tried to keep pace. The sound of footsteps echoed behind us, a chilling reminder that we were not alone. Suddenly, we stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood a circle of stones, adorned with strange symbols just like those in the cabin. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. This was wrong. The man collapsed in the center of the circle, gasping for breath. "You have to help me!" "They're coming." "Who?" I yelled, panic rising. But before he could answer, the ground shook and a low growl echoed through the trees. My blood ran cold as shadows shifted around us, twisting and writhing in the darkness. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her away from the circle. We darted into the trees, branches tearing at our skin as we sprinted deeper into the woods. The growling grew louder, almost reverberating in the air, sending waves of terror crashing over us. We ran without looking back, our lungs burning as we fought to escape the horror closing in on us. The woods felt alive as if the trees themselves were conspiring against us. I could hear whispers echoing in the distance, strange voices calling out from the shadows. "We have to find a road. There has to be a way out," I shouted, but I could barely hear my voice over the chaos surrounding us. Suddenly, we burst into another clearing, but this one felt different. The air was thick with a heavy mist, and the trees stood like silent sentinels, watching us. In the center of the clearing was a small wooden sign, barely legible in the dim light. It read, "Welcome to Hollow Creek. Abandon all hope." I froze, the words sinking into my mind like a weight. This wasn't just a road trip gone wrong. We had stumbled into something far more sinister than we could have ever imagined. Before I could process it, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. Shadows swirled around us, and I could see figures emerging from the darkness, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Sarah's hand as we darted back into the trees. But the shadows were closing in, their laughter echoing through the night, drowning out our cries. We stumbled through the underbrush, branches clawing at us as we fought to escape the nightmare. But no matter how fast we ran, it felt like the woods were closing in, trapping us in an inescapable web of terror. As we ran, I caught a glimpse of the man who had led us into this hell. He was standing in the clearing, eyes wide with fear as the shadows engulfed him. "Help me!" he screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. My heart sank as I pulled Sarah closer, refusing to let go. We couldn't let them take us too. Finally, we burst back onto the road, gasping for breath as we searched for our car. But it was still gone. Panic surged as I realized we were trapped, stranded in a place that was hungry for our souls. "We have to keep moving," I yelled, pulling Sarah away from the clearing. We ran down the road, our hearts pounding in unison as the shadows stalked us from the tree line. But just when I thought we might escape, the ground beneath us gave way. I stumbled, and Sarah fell beside me as we tumbled into a hidden pit. The darkness closed in around us, suffocating and heavy. As we lay there, gasping for breath, I could hear the whispers again, echoing around us like a twisted lullaby. "You shouldn't have come here," they taunted. "You disturbed the woods." My heart raced as I looked around, the darkness closing in like a vice. I couldn't see Sarah beside me, and panic washed over me. "Sarah!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the abyss. But there was no response. only the eerie whispers that seemed to grow louder, wrapping around me like a shroud. I scrambled to my feet, disoriented and terrified. The pit felt alive, pulsating with an unseen force that drew me deeper into the darkness. I fought against it, pushing through the suffocating fear. I have to find her, I thought, forcing myself to move forward. I stumbled through the darkness, reaching out for anything solid to hold on to. The whispers morphed into laughter, mocking my desperation. You can't escape. You belong to us now. Suddenly I heard a faint cry. Help! It was Sarah! I turned in the direction of her voice, fueled by the hope that surged within me. Sarah, I'm coming! I shouted, pushing through the darkness. But as I moved closer, I could feel the shadows closing in around me, pulling me back. You cannot escape your fate, they whispered, their voices chilling me to the bone. Leave me alone, I screamed, struggling against the force that threatened to consume me. Finally, I broke free from the suffocating darkness and stumbled into a clearing. The moonlight bathed the area in an ethereal glow, and I could see Sarah lying on the ground, a look of horror etched across her face. Sarah! I rushed to her side, but before I could reach her, the shadows converged, enveloping her in a dark mist. No! I screamed, lunging forward, but the darkness pulled her away. I felt an icy grip on my heart as I watched her disappear into the void, the shadows swallowing her whole. You've lost her, the whispers taunted, echoing through my mind. You should have never come here. I fell to my knees, despair crashing over me like a wave. I was alone, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. Suddenly, the shadows shifted, forming into grotesque figures that surrounded me. Their faces twisted in malicious glee as they reached for me, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. Join us, they hissed, their voices blending into a haunting chorus. You're one of us now. As I stared into their hollow eyes, the darkness closed in, consuming me whole. The last thing I heard before it all faded was Sarah's voice, echoing in the distance. Help me. And then there was nothing. As dawn broke over Hollow Creek, the road lay empty once more. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the whisper of the wind, hiding the horrors that lurked just beneath the surface. No one would ever know what happened to the two travelers who ventured too far into the woods, but the shadows would always be there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to cross their path. This is a warning to anyone who thinks they can take shortcuts through the dark places of this world. You might find that the price of adventure is too high to pay. Stay safe on the road, and remember, some paths are better left untraveled.